It was just another Wednesday morning, and my day was jam-packed with work tasks, endless calls, reports to review, and meetings to sit through. The house was peaceful, with only me and the dog around. My wife, Anne, had left for her usual morning run at 6 a.m. sharp, just like she always did. By the time the clock hit 8 o'clock, though, I noticed she wasn't back yet. Normally, she'd be home by then, but I brushed it off. Life happens, and I didn't see any reason to overthink it. When she eventually walked through the door, holding her usual cup of coffee and looking as energized as ever, it felt like any other day. Maybe she'd taken a detour to a cafe or decided to extend her route for the morning. I didn't ask. I've never been one to nitpick about small things. As the day went on, I got lost in my work, barely paying attention when she casually mentioned she had plans that evening. A dinner with some colleagues to go over a corporate project. That sounded right up her alley. And was a driven woman, always focused on her goals, and she had a knack for keeping her life neatly organized. Why would I question her? She'd never given me a reason to. That evening, when she came back, something was off. It was subtle, but I noticed a faint scent lingering in her hair. A fragrance that wasn't hers. It wasn't her usual floral perfume or her shampoo. Instead, it carried a masculine note, a blend of woody cologne and tobacco. Strange? Sure. Suspicious? Not enough to make a scene. I filed it away in my mind, like a note scribbled in the corner of a page. The following day, our routine shifted slightly, and told me she had to make a quick trip to the next town to support a friend who was going through a rough time. That sounded like her. Always compassionate and willing to help others. I didn't doubt her for a second, but as she left, I noticed something odd. Her car keys were still sitting on the kitchen counter. That wasn't like her, and was meticulous to a fault. I picked up the keys and placed them on the hallway table, assuming she grabbed them when she got back. Later that evening, as I worked through emails at my desk, my phone buzzed with a notification from our shared account. It was a restaurant reservation for that afternoon, a small detail I'd almost forgotten. The timing didn't match her story about being at her friend's house, but mistakes happen, right? I wasn't about to jump to conclusions over something so small. When Anne returned, I brought it up casually. She explained everything in detail, even showing me pictures of her and her friend at a coffee shop. She mentioned stopping by a pharmacy and described how it had been a long but productive trip. When I asked about the reservation, she waved it off, suggesting it might have been something her colleagues booked and forgot to cancel. Her answers were smooth, seamless even, leaving no cracks for doubt. A few days later, Anne said she was heading out for a shopping trip with another friend. It sounded routine, and I didn't give it much thought until I passed by her car and noticed something curious in the back seat. A small box, neatly wrapped in brightly colored paper. It didn't look like an impulse buy or a casual shopping find. The size and presentation suggested it was deliberate, possibly a gift. When she came back, the box was gone. She showed me her purchases, clothes, accessories. Everything seemed to check out. I didn't ask about the box. Instead, I kept it in the back of my mind as one more breadcrumb. That evening, as Anne showered, I decided to take a look through her phone. I wasn't expecting to find much, and that's exactly what happened. The messages were routine, with no red flags. A few new contacts had popped up, but they all seemed harmless. Anne wasn't careless. If there was anything to uncover, she wasn't going to leave it out in the open. Over the next week, I began watching her more closely, quietly observing while keeping my suspicions to myself. Every action she took seemed calculated, every explanation airtight. She moved through her days with the same precision she always had, but something in my gut wouldn't settle. One evening, she told me about an upcoming work event, a networking dinner. She spoke so matter-of-factly that it left no room for doubt. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to stay one step ahead. When she wasn't around, I checked her calendar. It matched her story perfectly. If there was something going on, she was erasing the evidence with precision. The devil, they say, is in the details. But with Anne, the details seemed flawless, leaving no loose ends. If there was a truth to uncover, I knew it would reveal itself in time. Patience became my greatest ally. Patterns, I've learned, have a way of revealing the truth. I started aligning my actions with hers, keeping track of her movements without raising suspicion. Small things stood out, the way she glanced at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, or the slight shift in her tone when certain topics came up. By now, I had collected enough breadcrumbs to know there was more to the story. It wasn't proof, but it painted a picture I couldn't ignore. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered before me, and I was determined to put them together. On Saturday, I decided to take action. Sitting back and waiting wasn't my style anymore. I had bought a GPS tracker earlier that week, a simple, discreet device, and I planned to slip it into her car. But as I crouched by the trunk, fumbling with the device, my dog suddenly yelped. I'd accidentally stepped on his tail, and his cry was loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. Within minutes, a couple of neighbors came outside, asking what I was doing so early. I tried to wave them off, mumbling something about checking the tire pressure. Sweat dripped down my neck as I worked quickly, hoping no one noticed the device in my hand. Eventually, the questions stopped, and I secured the tracker, or at least I thought I did. The next morning, Anne mentioned she had plans for dinner with a friend. It was a familiar excuse, one I'd heard before, but I wasn't in a place to take anything she said at face value anymore. This time, I decided I'd need some backup. Two old buddies of mine, Tom and Mike, were more than happy to lend a hand. Over the phone, I gave them a quick rundown of the situation. How Anne's behavior had been just a little too perfect lately, and how I needed answers. We came up with a simple plan. I'd follow her car, while they took a separate route to intercept her if she deviated from her usual path. It seemed foolproof enough. When Anne finally left the house, I followed from a safe distance, careful not to draw attention. At first, everything was ordinary. Straight roads, predictable turns. But then, suddenly, she veered into a quiet residential neighborhood. My gut told me this wasn't some random detour. Thinking fast, I took a shortcut to try and cut her off at the next intersection. Meanwhile, Tom, who was feeding updates through his phone, somehow misread a traffic light and ended up stuck in a jam. By the time we regrouped and had slipped away, leaving all three of us looking like amateurs. Frustrated but not ready to quit, we decided to check a local cafe where I thought she might have gone. As soon as we walked in, it was clear we'd made another blunder. The place was hosting a private corporate event. We stuck out like sore thumbs. Mike, impulsive as ever, blurted, "We're looking for my buddy's wife." The room erupted in laughter. Some people clapped, others whispered, and before long, we made a quick exit, our dignity in tatters. When I got home that night, things went from bad to worse. As I walked through the door, there she was, sitting on the couch, holding the GPS tracker in her hand. My stomach dropped. "So," she said, her expression a mix of amusement and irritation, "you're spying on me now instead of just talking to me?" I stumbled through an explanation, my words sounding weak even to my own ears. At first, she laughed, but then the inevitable argument began. She accused me of destroying her trust, of turning what should have been an honest conversation into some clumsy surveillance mission. I held my ground, insisting her recent behavior had left me no choice, but the damage was done. The fight spiraled out of control until she stormed off to the guest room, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I stared at the tracker, the device that had started this mess, and felt a deep sense of failure. Not only had my plan fallen apart, but I'd also exposed my suspicions in the worst possible way. My friends had been dragged into the chaos too, and I could only imagine how ridiculous we must have looked back at that cafe. Still, I wasn't the type to wallow in regret. If anything, the night's events taught me a crucial lesson. I needed to be more meticulous. Mistakes like this couldn't happen again. The next day, Anne and I barely spoke. I didn't press her, choosing instead to focus on rethinking my approach. If I was going to get to the bottom of things, I needed strategy and precision. She was sharp, and I couldn't afford to underestimate her again. Over the next 3 weeks, I let the dust settle and returned to her usual routines, and on the surface, everything seemed back to normal. But inside, I was preparing for my next move. This time, there would be no amateur mistakes. I reached out to professionals, a private investigator with years of experience, a hacker who could dig into digital footprints, and even an ex-cop who specialized in surveillance. I spared no expense. Uncovering the truth mattered more than anything. The hacker started with her digital activity. Within days, he had access to her phone logs, email accounts, and social media. At first, everything seemed routine. Messages with friends, innocuous social media posts. But one app stood out. It was encrypted and designed for discretion, something I'd never seen her use before. Investigator dug deeper and uncovered deleted messages. The texts were sparse, vague phrases like, "See you tonight," or "same place." They didn't say much on their own, but they raised red flags. One name kept appearing, Steve. The private investigators took over from there. Using their arsenal of tools, long-range cameras, directional mics, and more, they began tracking her movements. At first, it was all routine. Work, gym, coffee shops. But one afternoon, she left work early and drove to a small house in a quiet neighborhood. The investigators captured footage of her knocking on the door, being greeted by a man, and stepping inside. Later, they found out the house was rented under a fake name, but the payments were tied to Anne's bank account. It was a piece of the puzzle that deepened my resolve. A few days later, they placed a hidden camera inside the house. Risky, yes, but worth it. The footage confirmed what I'd feared. And weren't just meeting with this man, their interactions were unmistakably intimate. Then came the final blow. The investigators compiled a dossier, photos, messages, videos. One video in particular left no room for doubt. I sat in my car, staring at the screen, feeling a storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, and a hollow sense of loss. Still, I stayed calm. Acting impulsively wouldn't help. If I wanted to confront her, I needed to plan it out carefully. Letting her believe she was still in control would work to my advantage. One afternoon, the investigator called with new information and had a meeting scheduled at the rented house this Saturday. The tone of her messages hinted at something significant, something that made my stomach churn. I knew this was my chance. Whatever she was planning, I'd be ready. I didn't yet know the specifics, but the investigator's words echoed in my mind. They're planning something big. You'll want to be ready. Over the next few days, I pored over the evidence repeatedly, each piece stirring the simmering anger within me. But I kept my emotions in check, channeling that fury into careful planning. This time, there would be no missteps. Every detail would be accounted for, every angle prepared. If Anne and her lover thought they could get away with this, they were in for a rude awakening. This wasn't just about confronting her. It was about taking back control of my life, of the story that had spiraled beyond me. I refined my plan, consulting the team and addressing every potential variable. By the time I was ready, that morning, a strange calm washed over me. It was as if the chaos of the past few weeks had funneled into this single moment. I had the truth in my hands now, and the power was finally mine. The first step of my plan was simple but essential: confirm his address. Using some old connections from my construction job, I accessed property records for the house they'd been meeting at. To my surprise, the place had been built illegally. A house that wasn't even supposed to exist, now standing as the epicenter of my unraveling marriage. That revelation gave me an edge. I leveraged a few well-placed calls and favors to fast-track a demolition order. Within days, I held an official document that would bring the house down, both literally and symbolically. But I didn't want this to be just a legal act of destruction. It needed to send a message. The plan unfolded in 3 precise stages. First, I had to ensure Anne and her lover Jake would be inside when it all went down. The investigators confirmed their routines: work, gym, coffee shops, and the occasional evenings at that house. Thursday evening became the perfect window when their schedules aligned. I played my part seamlessly, acting as if nothing was amiss. Around the house, I kept conversations casual and light, giving her no reason to suspect I knew anything. If incensed I was orchestrating the destruction of her hideaway, she didn't show it. Next, I coordinated with a demolition crew. The centerpiece of their equipment was a crane with a massive steel wrecking ball, a device as imposing as it was effective. I hired an experienced operator, someone who understood the importance of timing and precision. The paperwork was flawless, the permits approved, and the setup complete. I even staged a fake construction project in the nearby area, fencing off the site to divert attention. By Thursday morning, everything was ready. I conducted a final walkthrough of the site. The the wrecking ball looming overhead like an executioner's axe. The team was briefed, every move rehearsed. There would be no room for errors. That evening, the investigators tracked Anne's movements in real time. She left work at her usual hour, calm and unsuspecting, and drove straight to the house. The confirmation came in. She and her lover were inside. I waited, my heart pounding, as the final pieces clicked into place. The wrecking ball hung ominously, the quiet suburban street betraying none of the chaos about to unfold. From a distance, I watched the house, a place that had harbored so many lies. Soon, it would be reduced to rubble. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I gave the signal. The crane roared to life, its mechanical groan cutting through the still evening air. The wrecking ball swung, its momentum deliberate, and collided with the side of the house. The impact was deafening, a symphony of cracking wood and shattering glass. Inside, the chaos spilled out, and her lover Jake burst into the yard. Their faces a mix of confusion, terror, and disbelief. But it wasn't just the two of them. To my shock, a group of men followed, 5 in total. Some were in various stages of undress, their expressions oscillating between panic and guilt. I froze, my pulse racing as the scene unfolded before me. 5 men. This wasn't just betrayal. It was something far worse. My blood boiled, but I stayed composed. I climbed into the crane's cab myself, signaling the operator for another swing. The wrecking ball crashed into the garage this time, a wave of dust and debris erupting into the night. And her group shouted, scrambling to make sense of the destruction. A few tried to approach, their voices pleading, but I remained cold, unyielding. Without a word, I gestured for the wrecking ball to strike again. It smashed into the sidewall, collapsing a portion of the house. More chaos erupted as the group retreated, their fear palpable. I stood there, watching the scene with grim satisfaction. This wasn't just a demolition. It was the obliteration of every lie, every secret, every betrayal. As the wrecking ball swung once more, I felt a strange sense of release. The house, the symbol of their deceit, was crumbling before my eyes. And in its destruction, I found clarity, a moment of catharsis amid the storm of emotions that had consumed me for weeks. By the time the dust settled, the house was a ruin, its secrets laid bare in the rubble, and stared at me, her face a mixture of anger and despair, but I didn't flinch. This was my statement, my stand, and I had no regrets. What happened next, though, would change everything. I climbed down from the crane, positioning myself squarely between Anne and the wrecking ball. My voice was steady, cutting through the chaos around us. Back off. This is legal. The paperwork is all here. This house shouldn't even exist, just like the filth you brought into it. My words hung heavy in the air, sharp and final. They froze in place, unsure of how to respond. About 10 minutes later, the police arrived, their lights flashing as they stepped out to assess the situation. I stood calmly, handing over the demolition permits and every other legal document that validated my actions. The officers reviewed them, exchanged glances, and, after a brief discussion, confirmed there was nothing they could do. Every move I'd made was within the boundaries of the law. Behind me, the house was a crumbling wreck, half destroyed, with the rest precariously teetering on collapse. I decided to leave it that way, not out of mercy, but because it was symbolic. The unstable remnants of the structure mirrored the fragile web of lies and deceit that had led us all here. It wouldn't take long for it to collapse entirely under its own weight. When the dust settled, I walked up to Anne. She stood there, clutching her robe tightly around herself, her face pale and her eyes cast downward. "We're getting a divorce," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "You'll pack your things and leave my house. My lawyer is already drafting the paperwork. You'll get the notice soon." She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand to stop her. "You've had plenty of time to talk. That time is over." In the following days, the house was completely demolished. The contractor finished the job as agreed, clearing away the wreckage. The authorities had no grounds to intervene, as I'd followed every protocol to the letter. I watched as the rubble was hauled off, each piece a physical representation of the lies that had poisoned my life. With every load that left the site, I felt a bitter but satisfying sense of closure. My lawyer, a seasoned professional with a reputation for ruthless efficiency, didn't waste a moment finalizing the divorce proceedings. The paperwork was meticulously crafted, leaving no room for dispute. When I handed in the documents, she looked at me with a mixture of guilt and defeat, but I didn't linger to hear her response. Her belongings were packed and delivered to a small apartment she'd rented. I made sure the handoff was handled by a third party to avoid any unnecessary confrontation. Once her things were out of my house, it was as though a weight had lifted. The air felt lighter, cleaner, free of the toxicity that had lingered there for far too long. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding. The scars of betrayal were still fresh, but they served as a reminder of what I'd endured and overcome. I didn't regret a single decision I'd made. Every step had been deliberate, every action necessary. The divorce moved swiftly, and signed the papers without contest, likely knowing there was no point in resisting. When the court officially dissolved our marriage, I felt a quiet sense of peace. Not joy. This wasn't something to celebrate, but a solemn acknowledgement that this was the only path forward. With her gone, I set about ensuring she had no lingering ties to my life. I revoked her access to our finances, closed shared accounts, and transferred every penny to accounts solely under my name. I'd left her $200 in our joint account, a token amount to keep it open, but it was otherwise useless. Next, I addressed the division of assets. Since everything was in my name, the house, the business, even her car, there was little for her to claim. My lawyer's foresight in advising me to keep everything legally separated during the marriage paid off. Even our health insurance and benefits were tied to my business, leaving her with nothing. The evidence gathered by the investigators was my ace in the hole. Texts, photos, videos, all meticulously organized into a dossier that left no room for doubt. When her attorney tried to argue for alimony or a division of assets, my lawyer countered with a brutal response, citing marital misconduct and misappropriation of funds. The courtroom was silent as I presented the evidence. I placed the folder on the judge's desk, watching and out of the corner of my eye as her face drained of color. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression growing graver with each one. "Do you wish to contest this evidence?" he asked her directly. She didn't reply. Her silence spoke volumes. The ruling was swift and decisive. She would receive nothing. No alimony, no share of the house, no stake in the business. Her lawyer's attempts to appeal were shut down almost immediately. As I left the courthouse and tried to approach me, perhaps to explain, apologize, or beg, I didn't care to find out. Without so much as a glance, I walked past her, leaving her standing there alone. Her belongings were delivered to her apartment, and I hired a team to remove every trace of her from my home. Furniture, clothes, photographs, anything tied to her was disposed of. By the time the process was complete, the house felt like mine again, untainted by her deceit. The divorce was more than a legal conclusion. It was a reclamation of my dignity, control, and peace, and had destroyed our marriage with her betrayal, and now she was left to face the consequences. For me, the end of this chapter marked the beginning of something new. Standing on the threshold of my future, I felt no regret, only resolve. The past was behind me, and ahead was a life free from lies, chaos, and deceit. This wasn't just about leaving and behind. It was about leaving behind everything she had tainted. A new chapter awaited, and I was ready to face it head-on. It took me a long time to heal after, and even after the divorce was finalized, her betrayal lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I threw myself into my work, rekindled old hobbies, and tried to rediscover who I was outside of being Anne's husband. I wasn't looking for love. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed in it anymore. That's when I met her, Marie. It was at a working party of all places. I hadn't planned on attending, but my buddy had guilt-tripped me. I was standing awkwardly by the buffet table, nursing a whiskey and avoiding small talk, when I heard her laugh. It was light, musical, and completely unguarded. The kind of laugh that makes you stop and look around, hoping to find the source. She was breathtaking. Not in a movie star, unattainable kind of way, but in a way that felt real. Her smile was warm, her eyes sparkling as she chatted with a group of people who were clearly captivated by her every word. But what struck me most wasn't her beauty, it was her presence. She seemed so alive, so comfortable in her own skin. I didn't approach her that night. I couldn't. Part of me was convinced someone like her couldn't possibly notice someone like me, still carrying the baggage of a broken marriage. But fate, or maybe my buddies meddling, had other plans. A few weeks later, I ran into Marie again at a coffee shop near work. She was in front of me in line, arguing with the barista about whether they had oat milk. When the poor guy admitted they didn't, she sighed dramatically, then turned and caught me trying to stifle a laugh. "What?" she said, raising an eyebrow but smiling. "You think this is funny?" "A little," I admitted, "but only because I've never seen someone so passionate about oat milk." She rolled her eyes but laughed, and suddenly I wasn't nervous anymore. We ended up sitting at the same table, talking for hours. She was a freelance designer who loved traveling, hated mornings, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of 90s sitcoms. There was something so easy about being around her. No pretense, no games, just her being her and me being me. Marie was everything I didn't know I needed. She wasn't perfect. She had a terrible habit of leaving half-full coffee cups all over the apartment, and she could be stubborn as hell, but she was real. She loved fiercely and openly, without hesitation or reservation. And she loved me. At first, I couldn't believe it. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some hidden flaw or secret to come tumbling out. But Mari wasn't Anne. She didn't hide behind lies or half-truths. She met me with honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. "David," she said one night as we lay tangled together on the couch, her head resting on my chest, "I know you've been hurt before, and I know it's hard for you to trust again, but I'm not going anywhere. You're safe with me." Those words hit me harder than I expected. I kissed her then, pouring everything I couldn't say into that moment. I realized I wasn't just falling in love. I already loved her. Completely. The years after that coffee shop meeting, I stood in front of Marie in a sunlit garden, surrounded by friends and family, and promised to spend the rest of my life loving her. She cried during her vows, and so did I. It wasn't a perfect day. Someone's kid spilled juice on Marie's dress, and my mom gave an embarrassingly long toast. But it was ours, and it was perfect in its imperfection. Mari and I built a life together that felt like a second chance. She encouraged me to take risks, to dream bigger than I ever thought possible. With her, I felt like the best version of myself, not because she completed me, but because she inspired me to grow. We traveled the world together, started a business together, and eventually, we became parents together. The first time I held our son, I felt a kind of joy I hadn't known was possible. I looked at Marie, exhausted but radiant, and realized I'd found my way home. Looking back now, I understand why things had to happen the way they did. Losing and nearly broke me, but it also forced me to reevaluate what I wanted, what I deserved, and who I wanted to be. Marie didn't just heal the wounds and left behind. She showed me that love. It's about the quiet, everyday moments of choosing each other. To anyone out there struggling to move on after a heartbreak, my advice is this: don't let the pain of the past stop you from opening your heart again. Love is a risk, yes, but it's a risk worth taking. Because when you find the right person, the one who sees you, loves you, and chooses you every single day, it's not just love. It's everything.